when we had this exhibition in mind, we thought for sure we had to do something with Evan. Evan is the person who did more than any one single person to make sure that our inaugural Audrain Newport Veteran Car Tour came off relatively unhitched. That's because he spent most of his time in the week or so before the event and during the event with his elbows up to his elbows in oil, which is not necessarily a bad thing because, as he will talk about the way these early cars operate, if you don't see oil, you're in trouble. Evan is somebody who revels in the technical and the minute, but his passion is such that you're immediately carried away. And I know for myself, I've learned so much just having casual conversations with Evan because his enthusiasm is so incredibly infectious, and you just get carried away in it. And I, for one, am very, very, very excited to have him here tonight to talk a bit about one of the things that we have this exhibition on for, the exploration of the incredible fecundity of imagination and accomplishment in early motoring from the turn of the 20th century through to the beginning of World War I. And we're actually going to start our little chat a little after World War I. So Evan is going to shock you all with this wonderful bit of information. So Evan.
Oh, with the little story I was sharing with Donald a while ago that kind of dispelled a few myths, but this is more of the aviation topic than automotive, but it crosses over because it's manufacturers we're familiar with. But he was talking about the idea of interchangeable parts and consistency in manufacture, and I was relaying a story about the production of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine by Packard during World War II, and how Packard received this engine that they were then to produce in a mass quantity for the war, and they were presented with a motor that had no interchangeable parts, made about 900 horsepower, and was completely hand fit and bench fit, and everything was fit. But while it was being built, with incomplete drawings and all this, and when Packard set to work on it, it was this 900 horsepower motor. And by the time they were finished, they had developed a completely interchangeable motor that you could take parts anywhere in the world and interchange them, no problem. And the motor, when Packard was finished with it, they got over 2,200 horsepower out of it. So it's, the British don't like, even though I'm British, half British myself, I enjoy dispelling some of the myths there that go along with
the power of precision, which goes back to a great story. We're sitting here in between a Model T and a Silver Ghost, and our friend Jay loves to pose the question to people, which car has more precision parts, a Model T or a Silver Ghost? And of course everyone always answers,
Ford, which is made out of higher quality material, the Ford. Ford is a master of using the best materials available in the most efficient way. There isn't 1 gram of wasted metal on a Ford because that gram would be multiplied 15 million times, and that would really add up. But he did not skimp on the quality of the steel. So the best material available to build a car out of, Ford used. They just used it with extreme precision. I could challenge you to save weight on a Ford, and to keep the car as durable as it is. It's an absolute, we sort of joke with Fords. It's like if you don't like a Model T, you probably don't like cars, because they're just a really interesting. You study a Model T, they're fascinating cars. They're very charming, but the precision with which they are engineered and refined is like no other car, certainly of its time period.
And I think that's one of the things certainly that fascinates me about this exhibition, the period that it covers, and especially the first part of this exhibition, is not only the fact that you have this amazing imagination, but also the development of precision, which has started in the Industrial Revolution in the UK and certainly expanded in the US during the Civil War and afterwards. and you have this sort of wonderful mixture of the craftsman, the Fred in the shed, and brilliant engineering happening all at the same time, and sometimes brilliant engineering inside sheds.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, you have, and I like to look at it in a couple ways. Is you have this great moment, and I think if you look at any technology, that emerging period is the most interesting, the most creative, the most fruitful. You can look at a computer or any kind of thing that's emerged, those early eras when there's lots of individuals driving companies and different...
And lots of competition.
Lots of competition and lots of creative thinking. They're not just refining something, you're creating something out of nothing. And I think the automobile is unique in that I think it was able to just attract a level of talent to the automobile that it's almost unique in the technological era, because it was so exciting and it was accessible. It wasn't like aviation or some of these things that people were interested in, but were harder to access. A car,
and where if you failed, you died.
Yeah.
And it's really tough for innovation.
And I think it just got a collective consciousness and a collective pool of talent in that early era. It was just so exciting. And I think because of that, the quality of the great stuff of that period is so wonderful because of the individuals that were involved in the car at that time.
There's something which is very interesting to me about the development of the early car field, and I wonder if you could explain your interpretation of this, which is the fact that many early car manufacturers started out as assemblers. They bought this type of engine from this one, they bought a chassis from that one, they put them together in interesting ways that they thought would meet a market demand.
Sure.
But at the same time, there were people making such incredible innovative progress that then the successful ones were the ones that made their own things. How did that sort of happen?
Well, I think it happens in two different ways. I think if you go back to the very earliest development of the automobile, it's going to come out of France. The first genuine scale production of automobiles happens in France. And the majority of it happens with the Daimler designed motor. The majority of successful French cars in the period were actually Daimler engines built under license in France by primarily Panhard. So Panhard has the idea of, okay, we're going to focus on the car, but we're going to get this great design and license the design for Germany. And they're going to end up producing way more engines than Daimler ever did, Daimler, which would become Mercedes. Producing thousands of motors in France and developing them. They licensed the basic design, but they developed the motor. And so Panhard and Peugeot and most of the prominent French manufacturers start off this way. And in the case of Panhard, would sort of be freed from the idea of having to develop the motor. They'd focus on the chassis, and they'd be the first company to invent a front-engine rear-drive car, which is still technically referred to today as a Panhard system car, a front-engine rear-drive car. Somebody had to think of that. We think of,
again,
you've got to go back to the basics.
It seems obvious.
It seems obvious.
Yes,
but
everything had to be
But no,
divine.
Everything was like this before Panhard. You put so you got to drive a wheel, so put the engine close to the wheel. That's what made sense. But Panhard, engine to the front, chain drive, midship transaxle. And they would devise in 1892, I think, the first car of that layout, and that would become the basic high-performance car layout for almost 20 years, that system. They come up with 1892. And Mercedes would take that design and incorporate their own engine improvements into. But it's kind of fun. You have to put your mindset into this. Everything we take for granted in cars had to be developed by somebody or a company. No matter how basic it is that we think of today, it's still a revolutionary concept that someone had to develop out of nothing.
And the idea that people were developing, as you mentioned, with computers and things like that, people were solving problems in any way they saw and they thought was the most effective. No one could tell them, oh, you don't do it that way, or it's not, no one's ever tried that, or that doesn't work. It didn't matter.
No.
So what are some of, if you had to pick Evan Ide's 5 great landmarks between 1899 and 1905, what would they be?
The Daimler V twin engine first. That is the most significant early engine that defines the prototype of a four-stroke high-speed engine. It's also the most beautiful engine ever made. Look it up. It's absolute, like, it's like the Winged Victory sculpture. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous thing. It's incredible looking motor. And that would power the Panhards, the Peugeots, most of the early cars. But that's certainly the most significant. I think the Panhard drive layout is hugely significant. To bookend, I'll jump right to number 5. Number 5 would be a car, the 60-horse Mercedes, which would come out in 1903, which I think still today would represent the greatest performance development ever to emerge in the automotive industry. And that car shows up in 1903. And then, let me see, I got the other great. So many of them are combined with. There's too many good things to choose from.
Exactly, that's why I challenged you that way.
Yeah, I know.
You could probably name 5 per year.
Yeah, I know. I mean, those are the landmark things, and but I think because with the Panhard comes a sliding gear transmission and 4 speeds and chain drive and all the stuff that is kind of sub-wonderful things of that category. So it kind of consumes a lot. But
well, that's another fascinating thing to me, and I know I've seen you get very excited about the mechanical solutions that answer some of these questions, because just the idea that you had to say, okay, I've got power coming from an engine, I've got wheels that I need to turn, how do I get the power from the engine to the wheels?
Right.
Is it chain? Is it a bevel drive? Yep. Do I need a transmission? What does the transmission look like? What is a differential? How do I account for all those things? And so what were the kinds of things going through the heads of some of the designers?
Well,
and how do the solutions reflect that, I should say?
Well, I think one other aspect that's interesting that touches upon this and what you said previously is that cars were still very regional, and the solutions often came out of different regions with different needs. Like if you look at an early De Dion, it's very much a car suited for the Paris streets. It's not a car for the country
roads, right?
Where Panhards and some of those other cars like that were more suited for and more robust for bigger usage. But I think they were both developing these things, but they were also quite sophisticated about it. If you think the layout of the chain drive configuration, front engine with chain drive rear end, not only did it solve the problem of transmitting the power to the wheel, but it also improved the balance of the car, because the transmission's mounted in the middle of the car. Now you've got engine, transmission, rear axle. And also now your differential is in the transaxle in the middle of the car as well. So your axle is very lightweight now. You've got inboard brakes usually up at the axle, up at the transmission. So you've
By the way, again,
substantially
we're going to get to this, and I just don't want to forget, one of the overriding things that excites me so much, I know excites Evan so much, and we love to do this to amaze people, the fact that everything we see in cars today, with the exception of some electronic computer-based things, were all invented before World War I. We were just looking at refinements. So he's talking about inboard brakes and transaxles, and this is all in the earliest cars.
And people think, well, they didn't care about unsprung weight and things like this, but they did, and that's why they designed the stuff this way. And I think the biggest mistake people today can make in looking at this era is to assume that this stuff is primitive, and the people that designed it were somehow primitive, and it's not sophisticated. It is extremely sophisticated, and it was extremely successful given the engineering limitations they had. And I think, people will always say, well, how come this car with the 600 cubic inches only makes 50 horsepower? And I say, you can't think that way. I mean, this engine, it makes 50 horsepower at 700 RPM. And it's making peak power at 700 RPM. It's making massive amounts of torque. They had to create a very efficient motor within a very limited RPM range. What they didn't have was bearing technology. They couldn't make high-speed engines. Engines make horsepower by making speed. You develop horsepower by making an engine spin. And if you're limited within 1,000 RPM, it's a bit like a commercial diesel or something, where if you have a very limited rev range, but what they were able to get for performance within that range is what's really impressive, and what they knew and took advantage of. And I brought this book along just as an example, and this book's published in 1904. But if you read the technical information in here and the things they discuss, you realize quickly that they knew way more than we give them credit for. They talk about scavenging effect motors and also Atkinson cycle motors, which are things used today by Ford and Toyota, and all this technology that they had and used in this period, but they used it within the restrictions of the period. So, we don't have motors today gasoline motors that make their peak horsepower at 800 RPM, and that you can drive off in high gear with 37-inch tires, basically from a standstill in high gear, and pull up and go, straight to top speed. We don't have things.
It's one of those discussions that certainly I have it all the time, much to the annoyance of most people who know me, about horsepower and torque. Horsepower is very nice to talk about when you're sitting having a drink, but torque is what gets the job done.
Right.
And also thinking about the relative development of speed and power. Remembering these are cars that come 5-10 years after most of the population uses a horse or walks.
Right.
And all of a sudden you're being propelled through the air at 25, 50, 100 miles per hour before World War I.
And there's barely a road in this country that you wouldn't be terrified driving 25 miles per hour on today.
Right.
They're absolutely horrendous, the roads in this country. But we had cars that you could buy that would go 65, 70 miles per hour despite the road conditions we had. And that's the other thing, a lot of these cars are configured the way they are, going back to this regional concept. That's why the American cars that developed in this era are so different from the European cars, because the roads were so different. The lighter weight, performance-oriented European car did not work that well over here when you had mud and huge ruts and all these difficult conditions. And that's why you'll see out in the Midwest and center of the country, the high wheelers were very popular, because the roads, they suited the roads. They weren't really used out here, but they were used there. And cars were very regional. And I think what's interesting, and there's always a lot of, particularly with the Europeans, kind of turn up their nose a lot of the early American cars, because they, again, think they're primitive and this and that. But no, they're just actually brilliantly designed for what they needed to do here in the conditions we had in this country. They had big engines and lots of ground clearance and planetary transmissions. They're very robust. So you have to look at the context of where that car was created and why. And that's what's really interesting about it. Cars become very standardized. And say by the time you get to a Model 8 Ford, that thing does most of what a car today does. But in this era, it's just a massive variety of things, depending on where it was made or what it was used for. You could have single cylinders up to 6 and 8 cylinder cars, and it's just an incredible variety of things.
Let's go back to something that you mentioned before about a perception about early cars, thinking that the people who designed them were very primitive and crude, and a tendency at times to want to improve the engineering that you see in these cars, rather than making them work the way the makers intended.
Right.
How do you approach that as a restorer and an enthusiast, to making sure that you can be faithful to the maker's intent and deliver a car that actually can be used?
Well, the great thing is, with very few exceptions, and most of those exceptions don't survive, these cars worked, and they worked. And I don't get a car in the shop that has like 0 miles on it. All these cars drove, and they drove, they worked, and they sold lots of them, and they worked, and they didn't have electric starts, and they didn't have windshields, or and there's a real tendency, and there was for a long time, and still is in some ways, but if these guys knew about this, they would have used it, or if they had this, they would have employed it in. So I'm smarter than those guys, so I think we should employ this or that. And I have a real big problem with modifying stuff, because I was like, this stuff works, and the enjoyment of it is figuring out how it worked and making it work properly. And it is such a slippery slope, because if you change something, you don't realize it, but it's affecting something else. And pistons are a good example. Like, oh, if they had alloy pistons, they would have used them, kind of thing. Well, that's fine to say, but they knew what that piston weighed, and they built that engine around the weight of that piston. So if you now put a lighter piston in there, you've thrown the balance of this thing out. And you might think, oh, they didn't know about balancing, and it didn't have a counterbalance crank. But they knew the weight, and they took this into account because they knew this stuff. And people change compression ratios, they change valve timing, they screw cars up. And I've driven lots of modified cars next to original cars, and you can change a car, but they don't make it better. And they cause a lot more problems. But it's sort of contrary to me to the enjoyment of the cars. Like, to me, what's interesting is how they did this stuff and how the thing was engineered and all the old stuff. Like, I don't want to
Now,
put
of
new
course,
junk on
I have to jump in here and just say that while Evan is saying this, Evan holds the world record for the longest drive in an absolutely death-defying 19th century three-wheeler when he drove most of the Pebble Beach tour in the 1899 de Dion trike. And I also curse Evan
60 miles
every day because I was driving that Roush and Lang electric roadster, and Evan assured me, he said, oh, no, the very, very, very old cars, you don't do the whole route. You drive around in Pebble Beach, and then everyone will turn off. And said, well, great. So we're driving around in Pebble Beach, having a wonderful time, and I see the cars make a right turn to head out down to go to Big Sur. I think, okay, fine, so I'm going to turn left here, and we'll see Evan again because we passed him a couple of times on the side of the road. No, Evan. I get these reports. There's this guy in this ancient trike, like on the Bixby Bridge. I said, oh my God, I'm gonna kill him when I see him. But it was the stuff of legend, without a doubt. I mean, even the owner of the vehicle, Rob Kaufman, thought, wow, Evan actually did this.
Didn't think it was going to do it. But again, I wanted to show that that thing was extremely original. It had never been restored. Original paint, everything. But I kind of wanted to show that this is an unmodified thing, and it worked then, it works now. Like, there's no reason you can't ride the thing 60 miles. I mean, it's not an easy thing to ride, but it's more than capable, and it's like, this stuff works.
Which brings us to the point as well of driving very old vehicles. The joy, I know for you, and I have discovered in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, is putting yourself back in the place of the vehicle rather than trying to adapt it or adopt it to our modern driving styles.
Right.
I mean, even something like that Rolls Royce. I drove that in an episode of Mansions and Motor Cars, and thanks to our brilliant video team here, you do not hear me shifting the gears the first few moments I was driving it. Because again, thinking about driving modern cars, and you rev the engine as high as you can before you change gears. In this car, as soon as the car is moving, change gears, because you don't need a lot of revolutions. That's not what they're built for. Right. And it also puts your head in a different place, and also, frankly, I think, makes it easier to enjoy cars like this when you do that.
Oh yeah. Well, that's kind of the fun, especially with the old cars. And I always say why a lot of the great early cars don't trade hands all that frequently is because you really get connected with your car the more you drive it and the longer you own it, because it takes a long time to really learn the car and learn how to really make it work well. Like, anyone can jump in and with a quick lesson drive most of these cars, but after years and years of using it, you can really make it sing. Like, you know how to shift it perfectly, you know exactly how to set it to get up the hill really well, and it's very satisfying when everything works and you really master driving that car. And it's something you don't really get in other cars. So you develop a kind of relationship with the car that's just different in this era.
And you mentioned hills. The wonderful story, of course, of Bertha Benz's pioneering trip to Pforzheim, rather to Mannheim, notwithstanding the fact that her sons had to get up and push. They built early cars, and the hills were there. There are actually more hills on roads then than there are now that we cut through hills to put roads through on cars that are eminently capable of climbing hills. And that's slightly ironic.
Right, yes. And yes, early cars are, My own interest is the older the better for me. I really like the early cars. I find, are the most interesting. And you get a real connection that's lost on newer cars between, you feel every explosion of that motor. You are keenly aware of every time that engine is firing. And it takes it to its most basic principle of the gas igniting and making this thing propel, every pulse of it. And you're not working with a lot of horsepower, so hills are challenging. And like I said, learning. You plan ahead, and you get to know what this thing wants. What speed, what gear, what setting, timing setting, mixture, and it's amazing what you can actually get out of those cars. A car that has 5 horsepower or 6 horsepower, how incredibly capable it is. Last year on the run here, we had a 5-horse Panhard, and we had 4 good-sized people in that car. And it's 5 horsepower with 4 good people, and it's not
1 horse
fast,
per person.
but that thing is like a little locomotive. I mean, it never misses a beat. It's not going to be the first thing down by any means, the slowest thing, but it's just amazing what it can do and how well it does it too. It's not getting up the hills fast, but it gets up every hill, and it doesn't really make a fuss, but it's like a little jewel to drive. Everything is so wonderful, how it steers, how it shifts, how it brakes. It's just this like brilliantly wonderful piece of engineering. And it's not a 0 to 60 car, it's a 0 to 25, but it's an absolute pleasure to drive this thing and learning how to really make it work its best. And those cars, those early cars are really, if you like a challenge, if you like mechanical things and you like a challenge, an early Peugeot, for example, that car has no throttle, it has no spark control, it has a 4-speed sliding gear transmission. So try to drive that thing silently through the gears with no throttle and no spark control, and it can be done. And it's a really fun challenge, and it's just pure machinery, pure precision machinery.
Now you talk about the relationship that an owner-driver has today with that car, but it also speaks to the kind of relationship, now granted not all of them, because many of the people that owned these early cars had chauffeurs who either taught them how to drive or indeed drove them places. But we also have come a very long way from truly being involved in how our cars operate. Right. Not that long ago, to get a driver's license, you had to know what the basic operation of a car was. Now you don't.
Right.
And so what does that also say about when the cars were made, how the makers thought that their customers would interact with cars and how they would interact with cars? That must have been an interesting thing as well.
It is interesting. It's also really interesting to read the old literature. If you read a handbook that comes with a car in this era, it's very matter of fact, about it. And here's a car you really had to be keenly aware of how it worked. We've got a 1902 Dirac we're doing some work on, so that English language manual with it, handbook, and it's it really, they're very good at writing these things, because what would seem like a fairly daunting thing to crank start it and get it all set and drive it, but it's they sum it up in a few sentences. You turn on the gas and prime it a few times and put it on. But when it gets into the shifting part, it's really, really funny how it talks about, because it's really hard to describe how to shift these cars. And in that case, it's a car with a column speed, three speed, and it would be like, they'd use funny things like, you want to shift with love, or stuff like this, or like shift with enthusiasm, or when they describe it. But you were expected to both have this car, and you were expected to know how this thing worked, and you really you had to constantly maintain it, and
yes.
they weren't dumbing it down, but they could really make it seem not that intimidating in the book. And that people did have chauffeurs, but a good majority of these cars were bought and used by their owners, and they had to. And if you think about it, these are people buying these cars. This might have been the first gas-powered anything they'd ever had in their life.
That is exactly where, because you're such a brilliant conversation partner, it's exactly where I was just about to go. we also, again, with our modern mindset, have to unlearn things that have become our habit in order to control these cars.
Right.
When most of the people who were driving them had never driven one before, so you simply are learning how to operate a piece of machinery.
Right.
And
Right.
that's all you do.
Exactly. And the and I think people were really interested in this technical aspects of the car. I think that was, they weren't in this early period. They weren't really considered a practical transportation thing. They were still kind of a toy or amusement as much as anything, or sporting thing. But I think one other thing is you were also kind of expected to. You were almost more expected to keep your machine in better order than we are now, or in later periods.
Oh my
because
gosh, yes.
You had to maintain it. But if you think about it, you can get in a car and hit that starter and crank away on the thing. Oh, it's not started. Pump the gas. Keep cranking the thing. With an early car, you've got to get everything set, because that car should fire off on the first quarter turn of the handle. And we're not used to cars that fire on the first quarter turn of the handle. So, you don't want to be pulling the handle 20 times. So how that car should be primed and how everything should be set.
One of the greatest joys, by the way, that Evan has, and I've observed this because he pulls it on me all the time. I'll go to an auction preview and I'll say, oh, let's take such and such a car out. He'll get this smile on his face. He'll walk over to the car and like, okay. It's like, don't you love that? Yeah. And meanwhile, there are other specialists around trying to start 1960s cars, and they've got battery boxes out, and they're injecting fuel, and they're trying to do all this stuff.
No, it's terrible. Yeah, the sound I hate the most at the auction is the sound of someone grinding a starter. Like, if it didn't start, it's not going to start from cranking it 20 more minutes. All you're going to have is two problems now: a car that doesn't start and a car with a dead battery. And so the early stuff, you're so much more in tune with it, and you keep it because it has to be. You have to know the car. You have to know what it wants, and it should start like that every time. And it's much more satisfying to jump in a thing that starts like that. And
now, on the greater topic of engagement, this is something that you and I have spoken about a lot, and I know that everybody here has heard that, gosh, what is the future of collector cars? The young people care about collector cars, and of course, everyone subscribes to the traditional collector bell curve. That means that only young people care about cars young people only care about cars that were built in the 1990s and the 2000s. Nobody cares about old cars, and certainly not cars like this. However, our experience, and your experience especially, has been quite different.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. No. I think because people are always asking me about, my favorite comment is all the people interested in these cars are dying. And I said, yeah, that's been going on for 80 years now. That's very true. That's true. And I think the great thing with these cars is they've outlived nostalgia by 50 years. The last guy who had a Didion Bouton poster on his bedroom wall when he was a teenager passed away, 60 years ago. And it's a testament to the fascination of these cars, is they're able to stand on their own as objects. They don't rely on nostalgia. They don't rely on the things that people think you need to have to be a car that would be interesting to people. They don't have to be fast. They don't have to be, whatever. They are inherently interesting, and they're also, they are just so different from everything that came after. So I think if you're, I always deal with a lot of younger people in this, and I always find younger people are so much more open-minded to the early cars. They don't have any, I always find there's a lot of baggage or something with people involved in later cars who are the kind of hardest to see the appeal of these.
Most of whom have had no hands-on experience with an early car at all.
Yeah, no experience. But if you're younger, and a lot of people, because these cars are rare, a lot of people that I run into at different things, they've never even seen a car like this in the flesh. And when they do, they're you're very fascinated by it because it's just so different. My background was in the antique car museum world a long time ago now, but
A long time ago.
we were always. It was always this push of. People want to see muscle cars in the museum. They want to see sports cars in the museum, or this and that. And the museum I worked at was Lars Anderson Museum, so it had this wonderful collection of early cars. And no one ever coming into that museum had ever probably heard of any of the cars in that museum. But those people who come in there were fascinated by these things because they'd never seen anything like them. And you can see regular cars very easily in lots of places today, but these early cars. I mean, even myself, growing up, I was always interested in cars, but I never got my hands on early cars until much later, because they're just not that easy to come across.
Well, going back to something you said about the types of cars that people enjoy, I think that one of the great things that we have an opportunity to do here at the Audrain, and you are a big part of that, Evan, as well, in your work with us here and your work in your shop and at shows and at events, is explaining to people how these things relate. You and I have the conversations all the time about, oh, you want to see a muscle car? You want to see a sports car? Well, let's look at Mercer Raceabouts and that's Bearcats. And if you go down, you drill down to the definition of what makes a certain type of car, power to weight ratio, advanced engineering, what it is, you can find all of those features in cars built before 1914.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll tell you, one thing it didn't take long to invent or perfect in cars was going fast. They had fast cars right out of the gate. And you want to talk about the experience of going fast. If you really want to feel like you're going fast, why don't you drive an early car at like 75 miles per hour or more? I mean, you feel like you're going 300 miles per hour. And
all of you here are familiar with the wonderful 1907 Renault Vanderbilt Racer that we have here. I was taken for a ride in that car by Evan in Amelia Island, Florida. And we were hitting those roundabouts at about 45 miles per hour, and he was accelerating through them. Yeah. I thought, wow, this is something that certainly got my attention.
And the most fun, I always say, like the most fun you can have the most fun you can have on four wheels is like a big, powerful, high-performance car in that era. Because to go down the road with 600 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, going 75 miles per hour at 750 RPM, you're not going to experience that in any other time period with whirling chains in the back. It's just, the stuff that makes this era great is never seen again after World War I.
Well, I have to say that I had a wonderful and very exciting moment driving not a super early car, but the 1916 Packard Twin Six, which the Audrain showed at Pebble Beach, and I drove it on the tour. And there's a wonderful moment early on in the tour, and coming down a very long hill, at the bottom of which is a very sharp right-hand turn. Yeah. And of course the Packard goes very fast, and it has two-wheel rear brakes, and I was warned, no, don't slam your foot on the brake pedal. It's a nice judicious application of the foot brake and the hand brake. I said, okay, great, I've got this, no worries, coming down the hill. A little bit of hand brake, a little bit of foot brake, wheels lock up. I said, okay, there's all those people standing on the side of the road there. So I said, well, this could go one of two ways. And so I let up a little on the brakes and said, I think we're going slowly enough, because the handling is wonderful, for the car to make the turn, and I'll turn in nice and early, and the people sort of backed up slightly. And I made it around the turn and said, okay, I'm not going to do that again. Now I've learned something about this car.
There you go.
And later on the Pacific Coast Highway, I was driving behind the Mormon Meteor, great, wonderful Duesenberg model SJ-based land record car. And the owner of it was having a nice drive down the Pacific Coast Highway. He wasn't going fast enough, however, so I passed him. And I thought, ooh, that probably wasn't a good idea either. But nonetheless, the car is such incredible fun to drive. But exactly. You talked about, they made cars go fast.
Right.
The go-stop ratio really wasn't an aspect
it
of
wasn't
this.
if you think about it, it wasn't a huge priority.
Right.
in a way. It's like there's no traffic lights, there's no traffic, so boats don't have brakes, airplanes don't have brakes, trains don't really have brakes to note. So the car brakes weren't that. I don't think they were that big a deal. And that also you were on dirt, so it was.
Yes, you can scrub speed off.
So you always, whenever you read a review of a car in this period too, it always be like, oh, the brakes were fantastic, and all this. You praise the brakes all the time.
Because they actually stopped you.
Yeah, they worked, and it always comes up. But everything in this era obviously is rear wheel only. Right. So there are some very powerful brakes, but you're limited, with rear wheel traction and also quite skinny tires. They're tall, so you have a long print, but they're not wide. So they don't, they stop well, but and that's the other thing about it. You learn how to drive the car and how to
Correct.
Anticipate.
Exactly.
And, the biggest thing I'm always telling people, especially with the older stuff, is just don't let your speed build on the downhills. You just keep your speed under control. You're always aware of what you're doing in the car, and that's the fun part. You're never bored. It's like it requires your concentration to drive properly.
What should people look for if they sort of want to get an introduction to very old cars? What's the best way to do that?
Just to get a taste, or cars?
Just get a taste, to spend time around them, to talk to people about them, and
well, to come to an event like the one here in the spring. Or there's lots of tours. There's a very active, these cars get a lot of use. The Horseless Carriage Club in America does a lot of touring. And in a way, they're some of the cars that have the most events you can do with them, in a way. The time period is very busy. And that's a great way, because most people want to talk about their cars, and you can usually get a ride and see them. And the cars are very friendly, and the people tend to be very friendly. They're not intimidating cars. They're not loud, Lamborghinis or something whirling through town.
Lamborghinis.
No, I'm just they're very inviting cars. We would say you tour with a bunch of old cars. Everyone's waving and cheering on the side of the road. You drive through with those Lamborghini tours. Everyone's
you might get other gestures.
Yeah, exactly. So it's they're very because. These events some of these events are quite big. Like the obvious one to talk about is the London to Brighton
Yes.
run, held every year in November, which is a driving event from downtown London to Brighton on the coast, about 70 miles, and it's limited to cars made before 1905, so 1904 or earlier. So you think, it's a pretty obscure thing, how many cars they're going to get. They get between 400 and 500 cars on this event every year. And I would say you're never going to go on a car event with more cars. And they're all made before 1905. And it's the most passionate group of people. And you're also not going to go on a car event where you're going to see younger crowd. Like the average age on that event is probably about 40 years less than most of the car events. It's you'll see car with all teenagers, all teenage girls. The next one over has got young couple with 2 baby seats in the back. There's just it's really fun and really family, much more family kind of event. And, because the cars are just so, they're just very charming and appealing. And that's a great event. If you could ever go to, even just to watch the start, there's just nothing like that event. It's the most special car event I know of. It's been around since 1927. It's the oldest car event in the world. It's got the most cars. It's also got the highest quality group of cars you'll ever see in one place. People bring out the best stuff. And that morning in Hyde Park, it's dark, it's usually foggy, and all the cars are rolling in to the start area, 500 cars with the gas lights on. Every car sounds different. Every car looks different. There's more variety of cars. You've got steam cars. You've got coal-fired steam cars. You've got gas cars, electric cars, the whole gamut. You'll never see a better spectacle of automobiles than that. And
your great introduction to that, of course, will be here in Newport on April 30th for the 2nd annual Audrain Newport Bristol Newport car tour. And that's for cars 1907 and older. which actually is a very good point to bring back. One of the other things that's great about London to Brighton is what it celebrates and how it relates to what it is that we see here and the pace of innovation. The fact that it celebrates the repeal of the Flag Act, which required that anyone who was driving a road locomotive had to have a person in front of it waving a red flag to warn horses and pedestrians that there was this road locomotive coming through, which obviously somewhat retarded the development and sales of motor vehicles in the UK. And so finally it was repealed, and so to celebrate it, they had this run down to Brighton.
Yep.
And this is a recreation of that historic run. And the fact that the first traffic ticket citation with a overnight jail term happened here in Newport, Rhode Island. We try to celebrate as well as by driving old cars as fast as we can down Bellevue Avenue so that we can recreate that wonderful moment when that first motorist was held overnight in jail. I believe he was doing something like 15 miles per hour in Bellevue Avenue. So wild people.
Yes.
The wild bunch you get.
Well, the way they start the event every year is they tear up a flag. That's the start. They tear up the red flag.
You're free to go.
Yep. And you're set right out. They don't. It's not. They close the. You get to go in front of Buckingham Palace and down this little closed off area at the beginning, but after that you're right into. You're driving in London. You know, it's just your regular roads from there down to Brighton. And I'll tell you one thing. I've done it 11 times, and you get to that. You see that finish line, man, you feel like you've accomplished something. Everyone has the same feeling. When you see that finish line, it's like you went to, like you got to the top of Mount Everest or something. I mean, you really feel like you go 70 miles on that route, and hills, and the cool thing is because you're starting in the city and you're finishing on the seaside and you do the countryside in between. So you get this incredible sense of journey, but also accomplishment, and you made it up these hills, and you made it with no trouble. This touches on the other aspect of this, automobiles in this era were like adventures. This was adventuring.
An automobilist was an adventurer.
Right. And you get that, you drive a car of this era that far and you feel like it. And you really feel like you did it. You didn't, not that the attrition is very high, it's only about 10% don't make it. But when you do make it, you are very proud of yourself. It's like you really feel like you've accomplished something.
It is, what are the aspects you think that someone should think about if they're thinking about getting a veteran car? What do you need to know about yourself and what you want to do with the car? Well,
I think it's there's a lot of different ways people come at their interest. Are they interested in the mechanics of them? Are they interested in the driving experience, the aesthetics? There's a lot of different collectors come in from different avenues. We have a lot of collectors who are very interested in the technical aspect and collect early cars for their various, technical, interesting things, or some are very aesthetic based, and other people are very much about the experience of using them and the performance. And I think, thinking about, and then just the history. If you're really interested in the history, it's a really deep dive, rewarding subject to be interested in. So I think it's, thinking about, what is your engagement or interest with these things, and kind of learning about it from there. And it's a fun topic. There's hundreds of manufacturers and different cars and different styles, and you can really get. It's a very rewarding thing to study and learn about because it's just so vast. You'll never touch on all of it.
You just made me think of something which is very interesting as well. You mentioned earlier that you don't get cars in your shop that have 0 miles on them.
Right.
And it's also sort of slightly paradoxical, but many of these very, very, very old cars have complete histories, which a lot newer cars don't have, because people have always known where this car has been, which I think is also very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the trike that I drove on the Pebble Tour, that did its first London to Brighton run in 1934. So if you think that thing has been in the old car hobby since the 30s, since before most of the cars were even built. So there's not, so yeah, they're I think because a lot of these cars were so special, they're so well documented. And you know every moment of that car's life, its whole time. And it's really fun. And, you know, to me, the history of the particular cars and learning that and finding these old photos and finding all this information is so fun with these cars. It's like an old car that doesn't have history is just a car. Like when you have one of the history of it is really rewarding. You know, like I always on the lookout for stuff for my cars, and I mean, I'll find like some like little photo of it from way back, and it's just such a cool thing to find like this stuff. You know, it has such a life beyond just being the car. You know, there's so much to learn about it.
And when you get to very, very old cars like these, one of my favorite movies, this is not a very good movie, is the Yellow Rolls Royce. But I love the idea of it because the idea of this vehicle having a life of its own that touches various lives along the way. And the fact that these vehicles have touched so many lives.
Right.
You know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, I know. It has it's just a whole nother element to it. And it's kind of what, and it also helps put in perspective why certain cars are important today and how they've always been important their whole life. Like this, it's been a special car since the day it was made. You know, I'd been writing up that Simplex we were talking about, and I was realizing that here's a car that not one time in its life had not been considered a really special car. And there's not many things you can say like that that's been around since 1912. We know where it was every single point of its life, who owned it, what it did this whole time. And it's pretty cool. Like there's these great cars of this early period that never fell out of favor in a way. They always they were special from day one, and they maintained that right up till now. And
you and I were just talking at dinner about Newport and what makes Newport a special place. And it's that kind of connection. It's history that lives. You're living history as you use this vehicle. You're a part of this.
Yep.
And that's incredibly thrilling. And you just don't get that experience in a lot of new cars.
No, and you know, in the exactly, and you know, I'm lucky to be able to go every day into my shop, which is full of these cars, and you know, when you go in and you look at the car, and a lot of these early cars, you just look at them, you know you're in the presence of something special. You know what I mean? There's something about the way they look. You know, they're especially a really good one, and a lot of the enjoyment you get from owning these cars is just that. Like no matter how much you drive them, you're never going to drive them that much. But how they give you a lot of enjoyment just from coming in and looking at them, because they're really wonderful things, and they're just so different.
I'm going to open it up to some questions, but just before we do that, I just wanted to touch on one more thing, which is you mentioned the idea of touching history. Mm-hmm. And when I visited your shop, which of course is a wonderful place, I was going to say I recommend it for all of you, but then he'd never get any work done if you all came to visit his shop. But if you get an opportunity to visit his shop, it's a very special thing to do. Actually, maybe we'll arrange a motorsport visit to your shop. But you get to also see, because of the respect you have for the way the cars were built and the way that you are restoring them and refurbishing them, you get to see how people worked, how they actually made the carburetor, how they made the axle, how they built the body. Right. And that must be very exciting as well.
Oh, that is, and that's what we do. And what's really interesting there is, for a lot of this stuff, in order to do it, you really have to figure out how they did it. You know, if you're going to do it, until you actually get your head around the way they did it in the first place. Like we're doing a body project right now, and really had to figure out, how did they build this thing? You know, how did they put the shape into this body? Did they bandsaw it out and put it together? Did they put it all together, then put the shape into it? Like we couldn't do the work we had to do until we figured out exactly how they did it. And you know, what I find interesting with the restoration part is, you know, we just do a huge amount of research, both into how the car should be or how they did it, but also how they built it or worked on it in the first place. And going back to like we said, I'm not a modifier. We are very much about putting things back exactly as they were done originally with this original stuff, or as we're replicating it as accurately as we can. And that is what is really interesting about this and really engaging in it, is doing that research and figuring this stuff out. It's not a it takes a full engagement basically to do it, but it's very rewarding. It's very interesting, and we're probably barely scratching the surface of some of the stuff, but it's really neat. I mean, that is it's not just, you're not just fixing things, you're really getting in deep and trying to find old photos of how they were, the factory photos and how they were doing this stuff originally to try to better replicate it. But also just this challenge of how do we make this thing work with all its original stuff as well as it possibly can, and this dispelling this assumption that you have to make these modifications and changes to them.
No, I think that you are one of the most fortunate people on earth. The fact that you certainly never have a boring day at work, and you get to live in this incredibly imaginative period of history, of mechanical history, of engineering history, of creative history. It's absolutely astonishing. So.
And quality. That's the other thing.
Yes, indeed.
And that's the thing that spoils you in this era, is that's what I always warn people of with getting into old cars, is watch out. You can be like me, where you get into it and you don't care after this about working on any other cars, because the quality of stuff in this era is so high. You
won't be able to appreciate the advance of vacuum-formed plastics.
Exact vacuum formed. Like in the pre-World War I era, the use of materials, bronze and brass and aluminum and all this incredibly high quality stuff, there was no one pinching pennies, no board saying, we have to cut this cost. They would be
too many spokes in that wheel. Take some out.
Over the top. Pierce Arrow is a perfect example. They had like 14 different body styles on 3 different chassis, and every one was cast aluminum, and no panels were interchangeable between the bodies. So imagine making castings for cast aluminum bodies in 14 different body styles for 3 different chassis. It's like, what board would approve that? The lengths they'd go and the quality to make everything. It's just, it's all downhill from there. It really is. It's like Rolls-Royce, with the 1909 Silver Ghost. It's all downhill from there. It really is. It's all downhill.
Sorry, he didn't mean it.
I mean, not that this is still a ghost, but it was always a compromise after that. This is the era. Cars were never as expensive as they were in this era, and
yes,
they would
something we must never forget.
We think cars are expensive today, but
yeah.
no. It's I restored a Panhard race car, raced in Newport a few years back, and that guy, David Wolf Bishop, had a number of early car enthusiasts in the U.S., had a taste for the ultimate stuff of the time and had no problem paying for it. And he bought a series of cars over about 4 years, and they varied between, those Panhards were between $12,000 and $20,000, and he was buying one a year in 1901. This is like more than a Duesenberg would be 30 years later.
Right.
He was buying these things every year, and then he bought a 60-horse Mercedes in 1903, which would have been almost $30,000 in 1903. He can't even compare.
No.
You could use the Google Translate, value, but it doesn't work.
No, it's not simply.
Those numbers are colossal. A Winton, which was a very expensive car, American car, was $1,000, and imagine buying a $30,000 car. When no one could afford a Winton. So it's and that's the cool thing. If you study those pictures of the races here, yes. That window of time in 1900, 1901, when the car was, it was the domain of the ultra rich. But these ultra rich guys were buying the coolest stuff, like X-Works Grand Prix cars out of Europe, getting the best high tech stuff they could for this time, and doing these match races and other stuff. It was a real outdoing each other with unlimited money, and it's pretty neat. Some of the coolest cars came here as a result, but just incredibly exotic machines.
Darn that income tax. So, does anyone have any questions? Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
So kind of a comment question thing, but by the way, so they want cool things like spaceships, right? So,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yes.
So I
That's just two guys.
Dr.
So.
Osborne, thank
Yeah.
you.
Exactly.
So metallurgy, right? So I'm a big motorcycle guy, and one thing that I've learned is that the Japanese makers were able to crush everyone because they figured out like what metals heated up at different levels. And you talk about how the French did really well in the early. Who mastered that? And my understanding too is that a lot of that technology, right, the recipes for steel came from the railroads in the U.S. Again, based on regionalization and heated up quicker and cooled quicker. So how did that play into who was successful with automobile and specifically the engines?
Well, I think probably the biggest area you'll see variation is within aluminum and casting technology, which aluminum is quite widely used in early cars. And if you look at what France was doing in that era, it is like leaps and bounds ahead of anybody. I would say you look at your Renault and you look at the castings on that, the transmission and the engine, we're no better today than what they did on those castings. Like there isn't a void, a pinhole, everything is absolutely perfect and they don't crack. So France, obviously the metallurgy, but also the casting technology. And France was equally proficient with the cast iron. The big Packards of the pre-World War I era, a lot of the cylinder castings were done in France on those. A lot of American stuff was done over there. So that, I'd say, the French were probably on the cutting edge, and granted because they'd been building cars like 10 years almost before anybody else. But I think a lot of our metallurgy and came from both, a lot of the early car companies in the US would emerge from firearms and bicycles. And both of those were quite sophisticated on metallurgy because if you look at the Pope products, Columbia and the Pope brands that got into automobiles, the metals technology they were using in their bicycles was really sophisticated. They were very lightweight and employing a lot of high strength alloys and very thin wall constructions. So those companies that transitioned out of those groups were often making the highest quality early cars. So it seemed like there was a lot of emphasis on that aspect there. I think I'm sure railroad as well. There was some I'm sure technological crossover, but I think manufacturing type crossover would be most prevalent through those two industries, especially in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned precision, early precision, like during the turn of the century. Did they actually have a concept for what we call quality control, like before
Boy, did they ever.
manufacturing lines? Like, in order to maintain precision, you need to have that, whatever you call it. How could you comment on how they did that before? Maybe it was an organized term, quality control.
Well, I guess you could sort of break it down in a couple ways. There are cars that were built more bench fit, non-interchangeable cars early on, and then Cadillac and Oldsmobiles and others that emphasized.
One of the questions that came up, the email that promoted this had some pictures on it, and actually you sent the email out, and someone wrote back saying, "What is that picture?" And one of the pictures was the picture of the Dewar trophy competition, where Cadillac had the parts all laid out, and they just put parts A, B, and C, and they just jumbled them all up together. So the precision work that had been done, and again, this basically came out of steam engines and firearms, that they were actually able to measure down to 10,000th of an inch before 1900. So they really knew how to make precision parts. It was a matter of whether it was worthwhile from a volume perspective to go to those lengths to do that, because they did it for guns because they need to make lots of them. If they were making 20 cars, you didn't need to invest in the technology to do that necessarily. But then when people started to do that, you had to.
And the tolerances and precision of the motors, no matter how early they are very high, you know, because the clearances for bearings and, you know, piston walls and all that is, you know, is not really different from today. So they were, you know, they worked within the same time frame of a few thousandths of an inch bearing clearances and all. So they were very capable, and the quality is very high, and the precision of manufacture. You know, if you look at you know, Pierce Arrow, for example, they have no gaskets in them. So, and they're not leaky cars. You know, everything was that precise that they didn't even need gasketing.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
A couple of things. One is, you said that Ford early on had most precision engineering. What happened? How come they kind of left that somewhere along the line? Was it post-war?
I don't know. I can't imagine there was any lack of precision. I can't think you couldn't take a part from a Ford and switch it with a part, you know, in the other side of the country, and it would fit as precisely as, you know, maybe there was I'm not as familiar with Ford later on, but, you know, quality designs or something could go downhill. But you know, obviously cars get more complex in what they have for equipment and scale of engineering and all this. And, you know, Ford moved from a company is a single model company basically to expanding. You know, Ford did struggle. You know, they lost their position as the leader of the industry in the 20s, and, you know, this concept that worked so brilliantly in its time is not a concept that would extend forever. You know, they had to adjust.
Some of these car makers became commoditized. I can see that would change. But others like Mercedes went the other direction, or at least in my perception.
Yeah, I mean, Mercedes.
Engineering standards were a lot higher.
Well, they were very high. Mercedes is the best car in the world in the pre-World War I era for the most part. I don't know if they ever maintained as high a level as they did in that period, again, as far as their significance and stature, you know, where they could be exponentially more expensive than anything and represented a performance that was vastly superior to the next thing down in the market. I don't think they ever maintained that kind of, that was a fleeting position for them. So, I think that's, you know, these companies are so detached from what they were in this era, other than heritage.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It is a difficult thing, and it's actually a discussion for a different setting, but I also think that it's a matter of the convergence in automobiles, just as in any mechanical object. There's less of a difference between a $30,000 car today and a $300,000 car today. Right. In this period, there was a vast difference between an inexpensive car, a $600 car, and a $12,000 car. We don't see that today. We don't see that today at all.
And one thing you alluded to, but you didn't really talk about, is these cars as works of art, which will always be appreciated by any
he said so. He said so.
Yeah, he mentioned it, but they're like, to me, and I drive a Mercedes, which I think is a beautiful car, but these are unbelievably beautiful when you look at them closely, especially the brass era cars. And I think any generation would appreciate that, like a Picasso or some other fine work of art. Yeah. And that'll always be there.
Well, I think, you know, the automobile benefits from being on the tail end of 200 years of American carriage making refinement. And American carriages were highly refined things when the automobile emerged. And the vast majority of carriage builders would become coach builders for automobiles. So you get some exquisite coach work in this era because it's being done by these companies with such sophistication and such experience working on the carriage sensibility that they were able to translate that into the automobile quite quickly. So it's something that had a lot backing it up, and the quality too. The carriage were extremely high quality. So the same craftspeople were building. If you look at that Roush and Lang, that's got beautiful coachwork on it, and you can see directly out of the carriage building when you look at that bodywork. And the combination of the stylists and then the people executing it, it's a great synthesis in that time period of wonderful stuff.
It's brilliant. Yes, ma'am.
With all of the research you've done and all the cars you've worked on from this era,
Yeah.
is there one that you say, man, I'd love to get my hands on one of those?
Well, I have a few favorites, but there is a car. There's a car in Holland that I've been fortunate enough to do the London to Brighton run a couple of times on, which is a 1903 Napier built for the Gordon Bennett trials or race. It's a 100 horsepower car, 1903, and it will do 95 miles per hour. And it's such a great car, and it has a great American Boston area connection to it. And it's incredibly original and complete thing. And you kind of find these cars that there's certain boxes that you tick, and this one ticks all of them because it's got everything. And it's
The only box it doesn't
sensational
tick is the fact that it's not in your garage.
I know. That is a problem. That is a problem. But that's a pretty wonderful. I have a lot of favorites in the era. That one is really high up on my list. I particularly, despite being a restorer, I have a real appreciation for original cars. My favorite thing is unrestored cars, are really, really complete, unmessed with cars. So I've come across a couple of wonderful preserved things, and that we didn't really touch on that, but that's another aspect of great enjoyment of this period of those really original survivors. There's nothing like it.
One last thing about electric cars.
Yeah.
When did they start, and do you have an interest in restoring those as well?
Well, I've worked on a number
Yes,
of
indeed.
Yeah.
Worked on our Russian.
Yeah, I worked on a lot in the last few years. Electric cars are very prominent early on in America, especially in cities. New York City had probably more electric cars than anything else, and they had incredible infrastructure for it. It was very popular for commercial vehicles, taxis, and private
Delivery
vehicles.
vans.
They had charging stations, they had battery switching stations. They had a complete integrated infrastructure for it in the cities. It was a very common thing. There was, even nationally, there was equal number of electric gasoline cars early on. It was, and this is going into the 1890s, it worked perfectly in cities that had electricity. And it's a big country, so it had limited growth in that era outside of those regions because you needed a easy access to electricity.
And especially after 1908, when the Model T was introduced, and you realized that you could now, in rural areas, have the kind of transportation that got you from city location, from rural location to the cities, and so therefore you weren't going to switch vehicles, and you weren't going to be able to support the electric vehicles in the rural locations.
Yeah, and the required infrastructure to support it worked fine in New York City, but it just wasn't going to happen outside of there in the way it needed to. But cars remained popular and with their niche, and they're really neat. Like you drive that Roush and Lang, if that thing doesn't blow your mind when you drive it, it's just, you've never driven anything more silent. Like a modern electric car is not as silent as that thing. It is so smooth. Granted, that is a really original car that's never been apart and messed with, so it's a particularly good one. But it is like, and you put yourself in the mind of someone in 1911 or 1912 getting in that car. That must have been like a spaceship, to propel down the road.
Driving
so
it
quiet.
because you are just being wafted through the air in total silence. It's astonishing.
And not a
It's absolutely
vibration,
amazing.
not anything. It
Yeah.
is absolutely, it's like the
Incredible.
magic carpet.
Take one more question, please. Yes, go ahead.
I was curious, you're talking about people being interested in younger people,
Mhm.
and what do you see as like the best resources for people, other than to just people with a little mechanical knowledge who've, you know, worked on cars as a hobbyist or
Yeah.
professionally, or, you know, not professional, I should say.
As a car or an organization or what? Or like a,
Car. Like,
oh, as a
a
car.
person looking to
Yeah.
go, like, you know, what would you think is the best approach for somebody wanting to get into these older?
Buy a Model T.
A Model T.
Oh, everyone should get a Model T. A Model T is always got to be your like first old car. It's just, they're super fun. They're really easy to work on. There's loads of parts. They're cheap, real cheap, and they're just fun. You know, they're a good car, and they'll give you all this. They'll get you going. You know, either you'll stick with Model Ts and want to get a really great brass one or something like that, or you'll learn about what you want in something else. But you know, we've all had Model Ts, and they're just super fun. You know, no one can drive Model T and not be happy. You know, they're just, and you can get one for like nothing too. You know, you look around, you can get one for $1,000, $2,000. You know, and they're easy to work on, and there's loads of information and used parts. I mean, they made 15 million of them, so there's plenty of stuff.
So there's
floating
just a few
around.
still around.
And they're not junk. They were a cheap car, but they're a high quality car. And it's different from today. You know, it's not like a Hyundai from the 80s or something. You know, it's a high quality thing, and it's and there's so much you could do with it. And, you know, they made in the period, they made all kinds of speed parts for them. There's all sorts of different avenues, loads of like
You saw the air
accessories
quotes,
and-
by the way, over speed.
Model
Well, except
T.
for the racers, yes. If you strip everything off
I was
and
gonna say, Model
do
T,
this, okay,
yeah.
yes, fine.
What was it, 8th place at Indianapolis?
Yeah.
500 Model T. So they like a Model T was the first, you know, it was like the small block Chevy or something of the day. So you could get, but they made this incredible variety of speed equipment. If you wanted to go race, you bought a Model T and made a race car out of it. And it went as far as you could even get a double overhead cam conversion for your Model T Ford. So like it got that extreme. So it was pretty neat. It was like the first car that like launched an industry of speed equipment, and it's a whole. But they're a lot of fun. And Lang's, you know, the main Model T supplier place is just up here in Massachusetts. So you know, we're fortunate to have them right in the backyard. But it's probably of any old car, regardless of time period, it's probably the cheapest car, you know, to work on and own. You know, it's just a lot of fun.
It also is very funny. It both defies and defines the definition of collectability. Because by traditional rules of collectability, a Model T should not be collectible. They made too many of them. They were inexpensive when new, and they weren't particularly specially prized. However, they fit the prime bill of collectability because of the effect they had on society and the people's connection with them. Because ultimately, all of our connections with all of these objects is emotional. And the fact that the role that they played in history is something that you just can't ignore. You walk up to a Model T and you realize this is a societally changing object. Some people argue that it's the most important technological object of the 20th century, the Model T.
Oh yeah, it's
And it's fun, exactly.
it is fun. Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
Evan, thank you very, very, very much for sharing your time with us this evening. And based on something that he said, our last exhibition this year is going to be about technology and its advancing, and specifically as it relates to aspiration. And we're talking about the 21st century, and we may bring Evan back to talk about that, because if we think that everything new is old, it's getting even older as we go forward. I'd also like to, once again, thank you for your support of the museum, for coming tonight, and also to invite you to our next seminar, which is going to be on February 17th, and we're going to have Richard Dragon speak to us about a very fascinating story of, hello Richard, say hello, wave, about registrations and the history of automobile registration, specifically here in Rhode Island, but a much larger story, which I think we will all find quite interesting. We just had a brief chat, and I just can't wait already. So thank you all very much for coming.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.